So I'm not going to introduce Iain. I'll let Iain introduce himself. So if I can hand over to Professor Iain Donnison of IBERS.
Okay, so thank you very much, Judith, for doing the initial introductions. And yeah, so I'm Iain Donnison. So I'm head of IBERS at Aberystwyth University. I guess, and thanks very much for joining us for this evening session. So I guess it's the end of a long day, I think, for many. So it's a long time to still be on screen. So thank you for doing that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and just to get right. So hopefully you can see that. If that's
that's good.
That's brilliant. Okay, thank you. So what I thought I'd try and do within this session really is talk about how some of the lessons I think that we can perhaps learn from two individuals really that are in Mid Wales, who are real pioneers in terms of both agricultural sort of sciences, and very much the sort of quite a holistic way of looking at this. And you know, these were, you know, genuinely from the sort of times they were doing it and what they were doing at those times, it were really very much leading the way, particularly in terms of grassland, but also the sort of how people can really live and have a sort of productive agriculture in what can be some quite challenging sort of but beautiful landscapes. And so really that's sort of the theme there. And really I'm not a historian, and I don't really intend to go into the history, but it's more that sort of feel of what they were doing then, and really how that pulls through to some of the things that we're doing now in the same sort of landscape, but very much often a matter of a few miles from where some of those early experiments were being done. And the sort of challenges we're having now, and maybe some of those messages that that we can perhaps learn and think about as we're doing that. And so hopefully we can have a bit of discussion about that as well. So this is really just a sort of, I guess, a collection of largely buildings really that very much relate to this sort of transition of what I'm going to talk about in terms of the links of the university with both Thomas Johnes and particularly with George Stapledon. So the middle at the top building is the what's now referred to as the Cledwyn building. So opened in 1937, and that was then the home of the Welsh breeding station where George Stapledon was the first director. So coming towards the end of a really quite a considerable period of work in terms of when that started up. So the point is here is these buildings are littered around the landscape. You know, it's very difficult, you know, that there's strong associations with these individuals. The top right-hand corner is the buildings associated with Porthpyron, which is again a matter of a few miles away from where Thomas Johnes, but also some of George Stapleton's work in the sort of Carn Hill sort of improvements sort of work was taking place. Bottom left is the Milford building. So Milford, the investment that I guess Milford really, Lord Milford gave was very important in terms of getting Welsh Plant Breeding Station and George Stapledon off the grounds. And then we've got at the bottom centre and right some of the new buildings actually on Gyda now, so next to those Milford buildings. So basically, there's still a lot of connections to these individuals in buildings that that basically exist around Aberystwyth and the landscape now. But really, I guess what I guess I'm interested in is this sort of history of where, so we look at the late sort of 1790s and into the early 19th century, where Thomas Johnes was basically built his new estate, and the work that he was doing then, particularly in terms of agricultural improvement, and actually the productivity from this sort of upland landscape, centre really the work that was taking place in the sort of particularly 1920s, but 1930s on, in terms of the grassland improvement, again in the uplands, around the same kind of landscape, but using the new tools of the time. And then on the far end is a photograph from actually when we were doing some soil coring before we were actually setting up some new experiments. And again, this is all of these images really are from parts of the landscape and literally a few miles from each other. So that continuity, which is really quite rare, if not sort of unique, I think, in the world, in terms of that, some of the early work that Thomas Johnes was doing, that stretches through George Stapledon and through to work that's taking place now in very much the same kind of landscape and the same kind of challenges. So Thomas Johnes was originally came from near Ludlow and Croft Castle estate, some National Trust property now that you can visit. So I guess there was Capability Brown sort of landscape, so came from that sort of tradition, and basically through sort of inheritance came through to the Hafford estate and set about a huge amount of improvements in that area, in terms of trying to get the productivity of that landscape and environment up. So making a lot of work both on the sort of the sort of cattle, sheep breeding and animal husbandry, but also some really, I guess, around things like the crop agronomy within those areas, and was responsible for over a number of years for on that estate for planting in the region or in excess of about 3 million trees. So it really quite a significant impact on that and creating this sort of landscape. Obviously the feeling about having this sort of picturesque landscape there, but also productive landscape, and also investing very much in the community in terms of building schools, the church, and investing in sort of healthcare at the time, and also because of a range of things he was sort of doing. He was writing, and he set up his own printing press, in fact, as well. So there was a Hafford press where he was doing that work. So again, it meant he could stay at the estate for more time, being more involved in the agriculture rather than having to go down to London and so on to deal with publishers. So the sort of period of very, very early on, really, in terms of agricultural improvement, in terms of really before there was formal agricultural institutes that arrived really later on in the 19th century. So, and then George Stapledon, which people are probably more familiar with, who was the first director of the Welsh Plant Breeding Station in 1919. And was very much sort of, well, started the plant breeding programs that are still there today. Last year we celebrated 100 years in effect of plant breeding in Aberystwyth. So some of the first, we've still got the original ledgers where the first crosses were made. so starting in 1919. So on some of the forage species and also on oats. And those breeding programs are still being carried out by IBERS now, and also have expanded to include a number of other crops, including over recent years peas, beans, miscanthus, and I'm sure there'll be there'll be more. But the work of Stapledon was very much, again, that sort of plant breed really pioneered that that improvement. So before then, there hadn't really been that strategic improvement of these forage species. So in effect, grassland was more or less what was already there, rather than actually going around and very much selecting from within fields, and then also starting these sort of crossing programs. And really there was a period of probably about 20 years before those sort of first varieties came out from those programs. And of course, importantly, that was very much at the just before and as the war was breaking out in 1939, and of course so we've got this combination of actual food security at that time, as well as being very much part of that sort of green revolution and improvement of crop systems that Stapledon was involved in. He was also, I guess, involved he was sort of interested in the sort of ecological aspects of agriculture, and also in terms of very much the need to be doing this improvement, for the importance of supporting those communities within the rural economy. So sharing that sort of strand very much with Thomas Johnes more than a century before, in terms of basically, again, how do you make at one level these quite challenging landscapes productive, so that communities can still survive and thrive in them. He also was, again, like Thomas Johnes, actually was quite reasonably prolific in terms of his writings. Wrote a number of books that are still available, and very much that sort of almost philosophy around the sort of around landscape and agriculture. So that work that was started by George Stapledon in terms of the first sort of collections is very much still, again, that started in 1919 and has continued to this day. So now the seed bank, there was a new building opened last year that's taken, and we still have some of those early collections that go back to that time when George Stapledon was making those collections. We now have 35,000 samples from the local environment, but also elsewhere, particularly in other parts of Europe, but also further afield as well. And actually, these are important because many of those landscapes or those environments have now gone. I mean, in terms of just the way that that I guess land use has changed. But importantly, obviously, that diversity has been captured and is still within the gene bank. So that sort of legacy, again, going back, and in effect the tools to work with are still the same ones. This is really just an example of some of the work in the last couple of decades. There's sort of work on the high sugar grasses. It tends to be quite famous over recent decades in terms of improving animal productivity. This is an example really of rooting depth. So again, if we're thinking about now some of the challenges around flooding and trying to actually improve the aeration as well, So this is actually crossing some North African grasses with some of the traditional perennial ryegrasses, which Stapledon was famous for developing. Those early perennial ryegrasses. This is actually putting some wider diversity in from some of these closely related Festuca species from hybridization, making those crosses. An important thing here that these plants generate very deep rooting, and they do that very rapidly. So it's a response to growing in a dry climate, but actually these are also quite important for creating aeration of soils and actually increasing the porosity of those soils, as well as making the plants more resilient. So if I mean, I guess many of you who see some of the, go close to the university sites, drive past them on the way into Aberystwyth, you'll see a lot of these plots. So that these again goes back to the days of Stapledon, when many of these plots were, some of the locations where we're doing them are now on Gyda rather than down on Penglaeth. Might have changed, although some of the sites we still use are the same, but there is still that that work around the plots, the single space plants, and the evaluation of those in terms of the productivity. The other bit is that Stapledon was always very much this sort of practical perspective of actually needing to, it's about the performance of the grass. It's not just, it's about how does, in terms of really how do the animals do when they're actually grazing these grasses. And that's been something that, again, the Institute still carried on with. So some of these aspects are part of the national list trials and tests, for example, but these are that practical perspective, and particularly working with industry and the farming community has been very much part of what the Institute's done over that time, because I think it's still recognized the value of that, I guess, that focus of actually around the practical importance of the performance of these sort of crops. So this is really just a graphic in terms of sort of why, I guess, is why is the sort of work being, or why was this work done where it was? And it sort of just relates to, so the map on the far left is a vegetation map. So the bright green is the improved grassland, and you can see that so Aberystwyth is very much in the centre of the sort of improved grassland regions in the UK. So the west clearly is wetter, more focus on grassland production. The east is drier, more arable. Clearly there are, I think, a lot of discussions again now about more mixed farming systems, but clearly the advantage of being in the wetter west in terms of grass production has meant why that has been a sort of predominant system there. It's underpinned by soil type, and so you can, the middle map is very much that underpinning sort of geology and soils, and that that's quite different again on the and some of these areas that we're growing, so these more mild conditions often. And the map on the far right is really around sort of some of the productivity, and you can see that in some of these grass productivities are actually lower in what might be regarded as some of the better grade lands, and it's very much driven by rainfall, which is so important for these grassland areas. Clearly things are changing, and that's one of the one of the challenges that we're all having. These are images over about some of the last sort of 18 months or 2 years in the areas around mid Wales where we've been working, where you can go from drought to flooding back to drought again, probably within easily a sort of 6-month period. So very rapid cycling of some pretty extreme weather events. And obviously this is really quite challenging, not just for the grasses, but also the soils and the sort of microbial populations and so on within those soils, in terms of that the system is almost at the moment seems, you know, potentially perpetually under stress, and therefore the challenges of actually developing new crops to be, new forages and so on, to be growing in these environments, but also again thinking about that overall need to be for that productivity of those environments to ultimately to ensure that the communities in them are sustained. So a series of sort of images from, again, that of sort of mid Wales sort of environment where we go, you know, you've got these areas of productivity, areas of stunning landscape, and then clearly the sort of agriculture that has sort of been sustaining in terms of sheep and cows and some dairy. That's from around Trawsnewidiodd, that's centre one, but also then these areas around like the Elan Valley, and which is close again to sort of Hafod and Puthpyron, sort of areas around, important in terms of for the these broader ecosystem services in relation to water and water quality, biodiversity, and a range of other important services. So I guess some of the big sort of questions and challenges that we're having to deal with at the moment, and have been, I guess, have been increasing recent years. We've been hearing about some of this today, and I guess in some of the sessions, and we'll be picking up on later on in the week as well. But this sort of the role of particularly ruminants in the sort of often a lot of the landscape in around mid Wales. And they're there because of that ability to utilize lignocellulose, so a material in terms of the sort of fibrous material that we can't really consume as humans, and their ability to concentrate, in effect, what are sparse nutrients from quite an extensive area of land, and obviously this important component around management of landscapes, and also the sort of ecosystems. And this sort of potential for fitting into that the sustainability of mixed farming systems, when particularly we're looking at sort of nutrient flows. But clearly there's increasing concerns in terms of impacts, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions, around the diets and health being increasing sort of themes in terms of around, particularly with things like the NHS with their Eat Well plate and so on, the need for increased sort of I guess fruit and vegetables in diet and so on, and also the wider environmental pollution. So so in a sense of these animals very much part of that landscape, historical importance for that landscape in terms of the productivity, but also now we're facing some additional challenges that were not there before. So this is now heading up towards around the arch here, as which Thomas Johnes was had built while he was at Hafod Estate, and then we've got the Hafod Arms, where tourists used to go. So this area is also really important for that tourism and the way that people interact with that sort of landscape. Some of the work that we're doing more recently, again, the way that Thomas Johnes and Stapledon were doing was sort of what new approaches. So in this case, in terms of sort of camelids and alpacas and so on, in terms of how might they be used in this kind of landscape for managing landscape, and obviously again thinking about the importance of those areas for both the agriculture and and tourism in those areas. And again, while Thomas Johnes was at HFOD, there was quite a constant stream of visitors to even this quite in effect inaccessible part of Wales and the UK. So some of the more recent things that we're doing, where I think we're probably very much trying to sort of be in that spirit, I guess, of thinking what new opportunities are for making these kind of, what other things can we do in this landscape. We've got these various challenges. What else might we do? So we've certainly been looking at how some of these landscapes can be used for maybe for different feeds for animals, but also in terms of for industrial or energy applications. So in terms of making new materials for a variety of applications, whether that's in construction or whether that's potentially going into platform chemicals, potentially replacing fossil fuels for plastics and so on. So, what other things are there that we can do in these sort of environments where we've got, we can grow still large amounts of, if you like, there's the opportunity for natural resources because of that importance of rainfall. But what else can we do with that, and how can we do that to sustain the communities in there? So this is something that we've been doing in the last couple of years, and it runs across this sort of landscape. So at the top end here, so we've got 4 sites that we've picked on, 2 of the university farms. So starting out at the Trawsnewidiodd farm and ending up at Pwthpyron. So again, at the top end, the top 2 sites very close to the HFOD estate, and also to where George Stapledon was doing his improvement work, and actually really looking at how, because even now there is most of the work that's been done on the performance of a lot of the crops that get when our varieties get tested in national and recommended lists, they're basically done in lowland areas. So these grasses and legumes and so on are not being tested often in the environments in which they'll be used. And so again, this very much goes back to the sort of thing that Stapledon and Thomas Johnes were doing, which was around actually really trying to work in those environments in which farmers are going to be growing them, and actually seeing, well, actually, how do these now perform across these different altitudes? And so now actually with the sort of latest technologies and actually the price of technology in terms of things like meteorological stations and the sophistication of those, and sort of sensors that we can put into the landscape at those sites, and actually understand the differences of performance across those, and also looking at not just sort of perennial ryegrass, but also a more diverse grassland and legume mixes. So from the challenge here, though, really is, and this is one of the big challenges that we have in Mid Wales, in other parts of the world they're very much looking at as well, is that you have this at the sort of lowland areas. So particularly at the moment when we're thinking about agricultural subsidy reform, post-Brexit, post-CAP, how will the agricultural subsidies be sort of directed and used to support agriculture? Clearly, there seems to be a shift in what DEFRA have been saying in terms of the policy in England through their environment land management scheme, or ELMS, which they're piloting at the moment, is more that funding around public goods. So potentially that could be uplands. It could be there's opportunities there, both from a range of services. The challenge probably at the more lowland areas, really, these are some of the more productive areas. So the productive agriculture is likely to predominate, When we go up to the uplands, it's probably going to be these environmental services, ecosystem services that are likely to be funded through these subsidies and so on. So really where a lot of these challenges are is this, what we've been referring to as the sort of intermediate zone, and how we balance both the opportunities for productivity and those environmental services. So how do we how do we sort of work our way through that? Interestingly, now one of the Natural Environment Research Council, it talks about the productive environment. So thinking again about how you do that. In Scotland, they've referred to this as the squeeze middle, in terms of that environment that's between the production and those areas that are likely to be supported in more the uplands. But I think this is going to be certainly one of the really big challenges for us, and for many decades, I think, in terms of how we get this balance right. And it really is still some of those challenges that Thomas Johnes and George Stapledon were working with that time before. So this really is just one of the big changes as well, I think, that we're going to be seeing over the next, well, it's happening now, but certainly over the next number of years, is that the way that technology is coming into agriculture at a range of levels. In this case, this is what gets referred to as agri-tech. So some parts, sometimes smart agriculture, sometimes information agriculture. So really the integration of sort of robotic and drones and sensors that farmers are beginning to use now, but also that way that technology can and is likely to be deployed, incorporating artificial intelligence and so on into them. So again, that's sort of putting this up really because this I think is very much in that spirit of how do we deploy the sort of these technologies that become available, and I guess not to be scared of applying that, but understanding in a sense of, I guess, of what, when we do that, what also are some of those environmental and social implications of that. But I think in terms of the way those the technologies at least now give us more ability to be able, particularly with these sensors and so on, to be actually doing that monitoring and getting the sort of trade-off right between that agricultural productivity and that long-term environmental sustainability. In this case, this graphic is actually trying to use sort of machine learning techniques to identify the distinction between the the grass and the legumes in a sward in terms of how is that balance, and then you can start thinking about actually doing aerial monitoring of swards in terms of what's happening in terms of the dynamics within it, potentially over a year and obviously between years. So clearly one of the big things that's happened in Wales in the last 5 years has been the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. So that's sort of requirement on us really to ensure that we leave in effect the land in as at least as good a condition as that we inherit it, and hopefully a lot better than that. And I think there's the sort of, I guess the graphics here is that range of components of that, again, that balance of the productivity where we can do that, the need for the land to be productive. Again, it goes back to we need that security of supply. You need that for farming incomes, but there's also that need to be restoring some of the sort of degraded lands. In mid Wales, we've still got large areas that have still have contamination from sort of millennia of things like lead mining, and also that need really to be those ecosystem services, that importance of water, managing water, the water quality, and also the sort of that environment in terms of those ecosystem services, including biodiversity. So the bottom one is actually a bottom right hand corner is a site which is SSSI that we managed for a period of time around how we might manage that kind of landscape, thinking about rotations of both of grazing, of off-taking of some of the biomass and trying to do some industrial applications with that, as well as actually managing that for a number of the species that were on there, including marsh fritillary and some mosses that were. So it's that balance of how can we make that landscape work, but also how can we have that landscape that's still productive. So my final slide really is this one of which I think is really quite important in terms of that sort of thread through to what Thomas Johnes and George Stapledon were doing, and what I believe we're doing now, which is this balance really that I think has been is what makes some of this work, and particularly in these complex environments, quite different to, I think, a lot of the sort of science that, if you like, can take place elsewhere. So there's this balance between the sort of reductionism. So these are both images by William Blake. So you've got Blake's image of Newton, which is the one outside the British Library in London as a sculpture, where it's, you know, Newton's focusing in on this, you know, this sort of detailed single problem, and then you've got this, you know, broader broader issue around that sort of landscape that's more complex than that. So there's need to really look at these as really quite complex systems. So clearly this is not about saying, oh, right, you know, this is so complex we can't get on with it, but it is about recognizing the complexities, the interdependencies within that, and actually that practical requirement to actually make this work, and make this work not just from actually producing you know, the most crop we can at a particular area, but how do we make this work in terms of productivity for supporting the community in it now, but also very much in the future in terms of actually the way that landscape and that soil and so on gets passed on to future generations. So at that, thanks very much for staying through to this stage in the evening, and more than happy to pick up some questions and just generally perhaps have a bit of a discussion around, you know, in terms of that long history of what's been going on in the sort of this area around Aberystwyth, and also basically what we can potentially learn from some of that thinking that's been running for at least 200 years. So Judith, do you want to?
Thank you very much for that, Iain. If people would like to ask questions, perhaps they can put in there, I think there's a little reactions thing and you can put up your hand, and hopefully we will spot you, or you can put it into the question box and then we'll unmute you. Can I start with a question, Iain? It's sort of a question about mistakes and hindsight, I guess. You had a slide of Stapledon merrily ploughing up the uplands, and I think these days we'd say that was a mistake. Would there have been people that thought that was a mistake at the time? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is do we have enough, are we likely to recognize mistakes that we make now? Or are we going to have to be relying on sort of hindsight, like was possibly the case in Stapledon's time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm not sure whether I can sort of directly answer that in terms of how many people at the time were really challenging that. So I think certainly, and I think, that is, you know, in, if you like, with you know, and probably for some time, I think people have recognized that sort of desire to, particularly around the sort of food security and this, in effect, supporting the communities in those areas at the time, was the driving force. And you know, that image there from 1938, in that area just pre-war, I think food security was a massive driver. So actually I suspect that would have, you know, pretty much silenced any other voices that might be thinking, oh blimey, you know, what might be some of the negative consequences to that. And I guess, you know, if we take that to where we are now, I mean, I hope that we do recognize more this balancing act. But I also, you know, there is, again, at the moment, you know, I think there probably is there is this issue around, for example, with climate change, and that, you know, real need to be acting now. And again, you know, are the things that we might do now, because that has become such a thing. Is, I think that needs to be something in the back of our minds, is actually, you know, we're you know, there is this big problem and we're focused on that. Might there be some negatives that are there? So I hope now that maybe, you know, those are some of the things that we have learned from the past. I think we equally recognize that, you know, loss of biodiversity is a massive issue now. And I think that is, again, another thing that's recognized as an ecosystem service. So I think maybe we've got, partly around some of the language we have now, partly around some of our capacity to be looking at these things, will help us hopefully not make, whether you'd say some of those sort of mistakes of the past. But as I say, I think it probably comes back to the urgency of the time, which drove that. So I'm not quite sure whether, I mean, hopefully that answers most of the question, but I think it is difficult, and I think we do need to be conscious of the risks of focusing on a single problem.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's yeah, the urgency of the issue at the time is kind of interesting, isn't it? And then in the future, you know, are we doing agricultural research for now, or are we doing agricultural research for what the world will look like in 20 years' time, I guess, is something that worries me sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits. I think it's a real benefit of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, in terms of having that kind of mindset. You know, basically, we should not be, you know, we should be leaving behind the land in at least as good condition as we inherit it.
Thank you. Marcus, you have your hand up if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, yes, thank you for interesting talk and presentation. Iain, I'm a little bit depressed, I have to say, because I'm thinking of, I don't know who said it. Was it Einstein who said that you cannot solve a problem with the same thinking that caused the problem? And when I looked at your presentation, I looked back at the agricultural history, basically sort of since the Second War, or since the wars, basically, when all machinery was taken from war onto land. So for me, tractors are basically tanks on the land, basically. And so this large-scale monoculture thinking with, and the big thing was always, and is at the moment as well, that's why I'm so depressed, we always think that technology and human intellect can solve all the problems. And I remember once hearing an African proverb saying, we need to do something urgently. We've got a problem. We need to do something urgently. So stop doing what you're doing. So I don't know if do you understand what they're saying. It's basically calm down and look at it and see what is happening. We're currently now, with all this climate emergency stuff, so panicked that we're trying to reduce carbon emissions. We're trying to do things, and we're trying to do carbon sequestration. We're building huge wind farms all over the world. We don't even have the ecological impacts of them. What are the wind turbines in the sea doing to the whole marine life? You know, all the sonographic, the whale stuff, the dolphins, how they communicate, you know. We don't know that. We're just trying to solve a problem again with the same thinking. And we're not sitting back and thinking, okay, what is nature telling us? And now we've got COVID-19. Nature is telling us something. And we need to stop doing what we're doing and just listen to nature. Listen. And imagine a different future.
Yeah, I guess I'm not you know, I think some of the things we're doing now are, you know, that it is, you know, as I say, we are looking at the way that we can use mixtures again. So this is a way of going now. Clearly, if you take something like the environment in which, you know, in many, you know, certainly the UK, and it was the same even when Stapledon was there, where the landscape was very much a human created landscape. It's, you know, it's the result of millennia of humans interacting with that. And clearly, you know, under Stapledon, that desire for productivity, that focus on, in effect, a small number of species, and we have that across the planet at the moment. There's something like, there's sort of often
20 crops, isn't it? Sounds,
yeah,
90%.
Yeah, and I think half a dozen, it could be 70% or something. It's you know, the numbers, the precise numbers don't really matter. It's just we have utterly focused on a very small number of species, and clearly when we're in a period of, you know, the sort of climate change, extreme weather events, that is very, very, you know, unresilient and very risky. And so I think there is a reversal of that kind of that trend. So that is happening. So I think there's a greater understanding of the need for increasing diversity. I mean, on the whole, I tend to be, I'm largely an optimist, and but there are bits that is quite staggering in terms of what some of those challenges are. And so, you know, one of the bits that I guess it's very difficult to actually sort of comprehend some of the numbers. But, you know, if we go back to 1950, there was about 3 billion people on the planet, and there was about a third of those living in towns and cities. So by the time we're predicted to get to 2050, we're going to be probably over 9 billion. And there will be at least 2/3 of those people living in towns and cities. So we've gone from 1 billion to 6 billion people living in towns and cities. And, you know, what that then means in terms of agricultural production, in terms of food, you know, the logistics of that is just absolutely huge. So it's, you know, I think I can't see how we can not, you know, in effect, be seeking to deploy technologies that we have. But equally, I think, you know, absolutely the sort of bit that we do need to be doing that in a way that actually recognizes some of those. It goes back again to that first question from Judith, as well as some of those, trying to make sure that we don't make, if you like, those errors of the past where people were so fixated about that single problem. So I guess I'm sort of, in a way, agreeing with some of it, but I equally don't think we can not do anything because of the sheer scale of the challenge of, one, the number of people, and two, the, you know, again, now, particularly with climate change, but actually, can we do some of the things that maybe actually repair some of the mistakes past? So I don't think we can stop and do nothing, you know, because of just the fact of just the sheer scale of the problem we have in front of us. But I think we do need to be very much more understanding of the risks of changes that we bring about.
Yeah,
Thank you. Can we move on to a question from Martin? Martin, if you unmute yourself, well done. There we go. Yep.
Yeah. Well, can I go back to, sorry, he's gone, where's he gone? The point about feeling depressed, in a way, climate change, or what we know about climate change, or what is happening with climate change, can be turned on its head, because that becomes our advisor. We can see what the consequences of what we have done have brought about. Sorry, Marcus. So therefore, that is what we must obey. Sorry, I said earlier I'd had my glass of whiskey, so I won't be very good on this. But you know, that is telling us that let's go to the planetary boundaries. There are our limits. We've got to stay within those. If we don't stay within those, we're wasting our time. Okay, so really we've got guidelines, and so everything we do must stay within those boundaries. So let's double back. Sorry, I've got two screens here, and I'm looking at people, but you can't see me looking at you. Sorry. Right. So in terms of agriculture and technologies, there's technology and there's technology, but there's also something else going on. It's not just about a need to provide food, because that is only part of the story, because our food demand for food has been hijacked as a commodity for making money to actually feed an economic system, which is actually feeding an elite. Okay, that might sound a bit strong to some people, but more and more, you can't help but accept that. The richest in the world now are getting richer and richer, and that is of their own choosing. And they actually, therefore, own 50%, the 1% own 50% of the damage we're doing to the planet. So that's where the real problems start. Now, I still believe, even with the population we have now, and maybe I don't like the word belief, but it's a bit more than that. An educated belief, mate. Well, no, I'm not that well. Sorry, give whiskey. So we can live. I mean, I've got a tiny farm, and I sort of thought, well, how can I do this in a way that isn't causing harm, but is still feeding me, still producing? And it's doing that. And so I believe that can happen throughout the world. But actually, our model is you know, all of our reductionist understandings, which are now becoming a wholer understanding, hopefully. The one other guideline we have is nature itself. Nature is so clever, so opportunistic, that it actually can tell us how we can go about this. And if we change it and upset it, then we lose sight of what it is trying to tell us. I mean, I'm getting a bit fanciful here, but you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So I think there's been, you know, I guess probably for a good number of decades now, there's been a number of ways of looking at this in terms of planetary boundaries and things, and you know, sort of Kate Rawthorne's, you know, book around donut economics, and a couple of years ago, I think, is really quite helpful there around that, you know, that need, you know, that the inner part, the inner circle within the donut, in terms of that need for again, that productivity that is needed as a sort of minimum for society and to function, but then obviously very much that outer circle, and in terms of where you start basically doing the damage in terms of that wider environment. And you know, so you then get into as you've indicated, it's around, some of this is around distribution, and an equal distribution in effect of ultimately around those resources. I guess in that case, we're getting into a sort of aspects of, I guess, that's sort of really politics rather than in terms of that sort of technology. I guess the bits that are challenging is, of course, is the fact that the sort of, because the environment is changing, and clearly, you know, I think very much, you know, a large part of that is actually because of what humans have been doing. A big part of that now is we can't, you know, because of those historical carbon dioxide emissions, that we've still got a major challenge that's for decades to come, you know, almost irrespective of what we now do, to actually get that fixed. So we'll be under challenge. That means we're going to get different patterns of diseases, you know, on crops and animals. We're seeing that already. You know, you get examples of things like in wheat production, you know, people are spraying 20 times a year for rust and things. You know, we really are up against a sort of a massive, I guess, those sort of massive challenges. Utterly agree. You know, how can we learn from nature? You know, what are those, if you like, nature-based solutions, and where can we and how can we apply those? But it's going to be a real challenge to do that in, you know, for everybody. So I guess we're agreeing, but I think there's certain bits as well where I guess we just don't know whether, again, it's that bit of can we only, you know, can we just treat this as a local thing, or how much of this do we actually need to do that's part of this bigger global system that we're part of with people in it. But I guess there's a clear bit about how we manage to get the distribution of resources around. And I guess in my case, that's not, you know, I'd say, well, that's politics. I'm not quite sure how that bit's there. I mean, I guess from our perspective, it's how do we ensure that the tools are there to try to at least allow sort of farming and the communities within those areas to still function in this changing world.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Alice. Alice, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I agreed with a lot of those comments around the capitalist economy, and I'm sure a lot of us are all in agreement with that. And I think the only bit I'd add was kind of thinking about what you were saying in relation to growing more food. That I've been reading Stuffed and Starved, which, you know, is about 12 years old now, and of course that's saying that essentially it's a lot of the food that we're producing is going to the wrong places and actually is being wasted, and a lot of it is about the distribution itself, which you touched on there. You know, the distribution of the resource is going to the wrong places. So perhaps, you know, if that was addressed, maybe we wouldn't need to be producing so much food because it's already there in the numbers we need. We're just wasting it. But I was also interested in relation to the work that you're doing. I understand you're developing heritage crops of apples, and I wondered, you know, and whether you were doing any other kind of heritage crops, because I suppose you're very well known for the science behind the moving forward of perhaps the genetic side of the grasslands, but I understand you're doing, you know, some of this heritage work, and I'm wondering whether you're going to be doing any more of that, because for me that's kind of quite exciting, looking at the possibilities there for bringing back perhaps crops and plants that were more readily available here and haven't been more recently.
Yeah, okay, no, so thank you. I think, yeah, I think probably again, when we're thinking of more diverse farming systems, I think we would predict that the future is going to look more diverse in terms of the number of different, I guess, varieties, but also the different crops that are grown. So yeah, you've highlighted we've got some work on heritage orchards, work particularly with apples, and we're also again looking at how, you know, that can feed into I guess product, well, you know, whether that's sort of cider, perry making, and, you know, again how that can help sustain rural communities in terms of value and linking through to to tourism and so on. I mean, there's very much this sort of parc naturel type concept the French have, where you're linking sort of landscape, the agricultural products, you know, the sort of tourism, and the fact that when people are buying things off the shelves, they're linking it through to that landscape and sustaining those communities in it. Yeah, we have been looking at some of the heritage work, has included some of the work on oats. So again, mid Wales, there used to be more oats grown, including in some of the uplands, and some of that would have been sort of forage oats, or basically depends on the year that was had in terms of whether that would have been grain or used directly as a forage. So yes, we've been doing that, and I mean, where I think that's clearly at the moment, some of that work's quite interesting is around, particularly when we're seeing some of the climatic effects and that ability to tap into some of that diversity that may otherwise have been lost in some of the, you know, the recent varieties. So one of the classic sort of, I guess, again, maybe unintended consequences that we've had for a lot of crop, I guess, variety, you know, what you might say improvement or variety development, of course, is we had many decades where crops were selected on their ability to use and actually consume large amounts of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer. And so, of course, one of the benefits of going back to some of these heritage types is that goes to a time before we had that large dependency. So there can be some benefits to doing that. But again, clearly are talking about a changing environment as well, and what that might mean for what we need in the future. I mean, as I say, we've collected huge numbers of different, I guess, seeds from different, I guess, meadows and grasslands, as I say, across the world, particularly around Europe. We went and collected a number that was actually, what's quite interesting, it was in when the wall came down in terms of the Berlin Wall and that whole opening up of Eastern Europe, is they still had agricultural systems that were sort of almost going back to some sort of medieval sort of strict farming systems and so on. So we collected then, sort of knowing almost that was a rare opportunity to go back and make some of those collections. Of course, that agriculture has now changed. So in a sense of that was a short window that was open for doing that kind of collection work. Whereas now that, you know, that opportunity's gone.
Thank you, Ian. Ashley, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Ian's perspective on that question that you just raised in the chat? Okay, I wish I could, sorry. Okay, so maybe we've got no microphone there. So Ashley is saying, what about GM crops, varieties that are resistant to drought and pests that require less inputs, or varieties that produce greater yield on the same amount of land? So this is a question about whether GM crops can actually be used as a force for good in the future.
Yeah, no, so I guess another sort of interesting question. There's also, I guess, it's probably worth also flagging up that there's been quite a lot of discussion, including at the moment, as the agriculture bill has been going through the House of Lords in relation to this technology that's referred to as gene editing. And so this is, so the big discussion there, so if people are hearing about this in terms of as gene editing as a tool, is actually making these, so it's using, I guess, some of the approaches are similar to sort of, it sort of sits somewhere between, if you like, GM and conventional breeding. So it sort of has features of both, but I guess one of the key features is that actually at the end of the day, you can't tell the difference between a gene edited crop and one that actually is being generated from conventional breeding. So there isn't, if you like, any alien DNA in those. So that's where a lot of the discussions are taking place at the moment in terms of whether in effect post Brexit, that kind of technology may be available in the UK. So there are tools that aren't regarded as GM, but are still sort of referred to as, I guess, a sort of new breeding technology. So if you're looking at those new technologies, and if those were able to have that significant impact, I guess that then, I think that's always then a question of, it's the sort of question for society is, these tools are available, we can do this with this tool, is as a society, do we believe that we should do that? And I think to date, the examples we've had of GM crops have tended to be have had quite narrow, in effect, applications. So, for example, the sort of things like the Roundup Ready, so the ability to combine GM crops with herbicide resistance, or around the corn borer, so a pest in maize and sort of related species. So I guess to date we haven't really had a clear example that's probably that one way you can say, right, here is a GM manipulation that delivers this huge benefit, and now as a society, do we wish to use that? So I think that's really the challenge we're under. My personal view is we shouldn't be ruling these things out, because potentially we could be in that position. But equally, I think until we have something quite clear, it's not easy to make that argument of absolutely we should be using and deploying this technology at the moment. And equally, I think certainly from the work that we do, and as I say, started with Stapledon in terms of those breeding programs, we're working with a lot of genetic diversity. So we've still got a lot we can do with that. Doesn't mean to say that there might come a point where, potentially either because of, a real need to deal with drought, or particularly perhaps something like a disease. And certainly that is, I think there's concerns that, we've seen, the impact on a human pandemic, those risks exist certainly for crops, and also for livestock. So, there are sometimes where certain tools may become societally acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the great tragedies is that because we're so anti-GM in the UK, effectively what's happened is that research has been outsourced to the US, where they've got a completely different regulatory regime, and that actually, if GM was being driven by society for some public good, as Ashley says, the golden rice type example, whether if we collectively decided as a society as what the aims of that technology would be, rather than just leaving it to companies in the US, which just seems completely the wrong way of doing things. Okay, so anybody got a final burning question they would like to ask, or shall we wrap it up and all go and drink Martin's whiskey?
Too late. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I was unmuted, wasn't it? It's all gone.
Okay. So I think that's it on the questions then. I guess what remains for me to do is to thank Iain for his interesting presentation on history and the future. And also to thank you all for turning up at this late hour. The next session starts bright and early at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and it's Fionn Storer Jones talking about diversity. You can use the same conference link to get back in again tomorrow morning. Yeah, I think on that note, thank you very much and have a good rest of your evening.